Good morning everyone. Today we will talk about the enjoyment of sensation in video game, or how a game makes you feel a certain way through its control and sounds. And what better game to talk about this topic other than Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Volleyball? Just kidding. Let's try that again. Video games normally use their control scheme, sound effects, and music to convey a certain feeling or sensation. Survival horror games like Resident Evil normally would make a movement of the character slow and sluggish to make the player feel more tension. Okay, until they get to number 5. In this presentation, we are going to talk about an indie game that has a unique method of making the player feel tension and urgency. Welcome to the Crypt of the Necrodancer. Crypt of the Necrodancer at its core is a dungeon crawler with a twist in its movement mechanics. You control a single player character with only 4 keys, which are bound to the keyboard arrow keys by default. The players and the enemies' actions are dictated by the beat of the game's background music. The player's actions have to follow the rhythm of the music. Similarly, the enemies also move with the music speed, whether the player moves or not. The levels are procedurally generated and divided into grids. Each zone in the game consists of 3 levels, with the last level reserved exclusively for the boss fight. The player starts every zone with nothing but their permanent character upgrades and a dagger as the starting weapon. Every object in the game fills up 1 tile in the grid. If the player dies, the level is completely remade and the player has to start over from the beginning of the level, losing all the weapons and items that they have gained. This means that every instance of the gameplay is new, and whatever information the player has gained about the level in their previous play is useless. The player and most of the enemies move 1 tile at a time. The player attacks the enemy by moving into their tile, and the enemy attacks the player by moving into the player's tile. Every enemy has their own attack and movement pattern, creating complexity for the game. Objects like coins and weapons are picked up simply by moving into the tiles they are on. Other actions such as using items and magic are done by pressing a combination of 2 arrow keys at the same time. Every action done to interactable objects are done also by moving into their tiles. Doors and chests are opened by simply moving towards them. The walls of the level can be dug also by simply moving towards them. Traps and stairs are triggered by stepping onto them. Buying items from the shopkeeper is done by moving onto the item you want to buy. Next, let's talk about the combat mechanics. Killing enemies increases the coin multiplier. This coin multiplier is used to increase the amount of gold the player picks up. When the enemies are killed, they drop gold. The coin multiplier is lost when the player misses a beat, gets hit by an enemy, or they dig through a wall that is too hard for them to dig. The level's floor is lit up by different color in checkered pattern when the coin multiplier reaches 2. This is called the disco floor effect. The player becomes stronger by buying permanent upgrades sold by the NPCs using diamonds acquired in the dungeons, and new NPCs are unlocked as you save them from the dungeons. They also sell better items and weapons to be made available as the treasure chest's content. There are different types of weapons and spells that behave differently. For example, the broadsword attacks horizontally 3 tiles in front of the player. The spear can attack an enemy 2 tiles away from the player and can be thrown. The freeze spell freezes all enemy on the screen, while the fire spell shoots fireballs horizontally. These weapons can be found in dungeons once you unlock them from the NPCs. As you can see, all interactions within the game is done exclusively via the movement system. Because of how actions are done, the game feels like dancing in a dungeon full of monsters trying to kill you as you tango your way to victory or death. It gives satisfaction when you can keep moving according to the music and not make any mistake. However, when the player makes a mistake, it feels very disappointing as you lose all your coin multiplier and the disco floor effect. Having more objects like treasure chests, pillars, and different type of enemies in a room increases the difficulty and complexity of the room. making the player feel more tension as they have to dance around the enemies while making quick decisions every beat. Preserving the coin multiplier for an extended period of time increases the tension, as the bigger the multiplier that the player has acquired, the more the player has to lose. Making this work wouldn't be possible with a clunky and frustrating control scheme. By using only 4 buttons bound to the 4 directions of travel in the game, the control scheme becomes very simple and intuitive. The game later introduces more advanced actions like throwing weapons or using items, which require 2 of the 4 buttons to be pressed at the same time. For example, in order to throw your weapon, you have to press left and up at the same time, and then press the direction you want to throw to. Since the player can only act on the beat of the music, the control's responsiveness will vary depending on the player's accuracy. As a result, the game feels very much like a rhythm game where the player is trying to dance to the music. After all, the music in this game dictates the tempo of the whole game. Missing the beat makes the character do nothing, which leaves you vulnerable to attack and resets the coin multiplayer. Sticking to the beat, on the other hand, preserves the coin multiplayer and gives the player a sense of mastery to the game's control. The music also helps manipulate the dramatic arc of the game as the player advances through the levels. This is done by increasing the tempo of subsequent levels' music. Almost doubling it by the time the player reaches the boss fight, which is practically the climax of the level. The music is influenced by the environment too. One particular enemy, for example, can almost mute the background music, giving the sensation of being deaf to the player, or there are traps that alter the tempo of the background music, thus changing the tempo of the gameplay entirely. Sound effects are played whenever the player hits the walls or an enemy and vice versa. This effect helps the player perceive game events that happen in an instant. Some polish effects are worth highlighting. First, there is an auto-calibration system for the perfect beat that is triggered when the game senses that the player is becoming stressed. This feature is not mentioned in the game and takes effect without the player's knowledge in order to make the control less frustrating. Ryan Clark, the game's creator, noted on this topic. I noticed that players naturally drift away from the beat when stressed, then drift back towards it afterward. They would sometimes miss a beat due to this stress and get frustrated, so I used a Leaky integrator to implement an auto-calibration system. If the player is moving a little faster or slower than the beat, the game will slowly shift the effective position of each beat to match. This can only be pushed so far, but it does help to ensure that the player doesn't receive a miss when they feel like they were indeed on the beat. Besides the sound effects, the game also shakes the screen every time the player hits or gets hit by an enemy, making the consequence of the actions more dramatic and noticeable, giving the player valuable feedback. Next, there is the disco floor effect. This refers to the coloring of the level's floor in checkered pattern after the coin multiplier hits 2. This effect helps to enforce the music's beat, as the pattern changes color and position after every beat. There are some things that we can learn from Crypt of the Necrodancer's design. One lesson to be learned is that you can use rhythm to create tension and flow. By requiring the player to stick to a rhythm without skipping a beat, the game puts pressure on the player to act. This constant state of tension and challenge contributes to the general flow state of the player. The second one is about the efficiency of button mapping. This game only uses 4 buttons to allow players to do a variety of different actions. Because of this, the game is very easy to learn and control, but hard to master. Last but not least, making both the player and the enemies obey the same rules makes for a fair game and thus less frustrating experience. In Crypt of the Necrodancer, every entity in the game follows 2 rules. First, any actions are done at the beat of the music. Second, all movement advances any entity by 1 tile every beat. With these rules in mind, the developer made enemies with a variety of movement and attack patterns that feels fair but still very interesting.